I totally botched the recording here, and the audio sounds like trash. So we're starting with a little bit of a different take here. And today I'm going to be trying to tell you exactly what I was trying to say in this video. We're working on the Axial XC1 or AX24. Recently put some heavier rims, some new foams, some new tires, and they're great, but generally speaking, the car is not heavy enough. And so when it goes up and over a rock, it doesn't get the compression in the tire that I was hoping to see, where that tire squishes down, we get a bigger contact patch, and then ultimately have more traction. It's just not happening. And so that's what I would want to see right here. But what's ultimately happening is the tire kind of just stays its normal shape. So I think the first step is probably throw some more weight on this thing. It doesn't weigh a ton. And I've got some parts from Endura that are going to help with that. So I've got some front and rear diff covers. We've got some axle extenders, which I'm not sold on using. And then we've got a brass plate to go over the center of transmission there. And then I also have some steering knuckles that I'll use on the front of the car. Although theoretically you could put steering knuckles on front and rear. This set only came with one pair because most cars don't have rear wheel steering. So we'll just be putting on the front wheel steering knuckles. So yeah, strap in. We got a good one. So as sort of a baseline here, we're going to see how this does going up and over this rock. And we can see that it starts to go over, it gets on that sharp point, and it just doesn't really bite down and get a larger contact patch as the tire compresses over that sharp point. You get to see a little bit of it right here on the rear, but not what we're looking for exactly. Ideally, you get something a little bit bigger, something equivalent to like if you were in an actual Jeep and you were down to like 6 PSI and you want to see these things kind of just flatten and take on the shape of the rock. All right, let's get started here. Step one, let's get these tires off. All right, I'll be honest, I didn't have anything else to say at this point in time other than look at me go, taking off 1, 2, 3, 4 tires. Woohoo, we did it. Easy peasy, stack them up in an order that makes sense, and now we're good to go. All right, we'll get our new brass skid plate out, and we'll start to take off the sides of the chassis, or like the boat plate rockers, whatever they're called. There's 2 long screws that we'll pull out that connect the side skid plate there, as well as attach the lower linkages into that skid plate on the bottom. So once we pull those screws out, we can see that lower linkage just comes right out. We'll do it on both sides. And then we'll start to unscrew some of the screws that are going to hold the transmission and motor into that skid plate. What I found was that these were super soft metal out the gate, and I ended up having to use pliers to twist them out. But once you get that out, you can actually start working on getting the skid plate out, which has 2 little pins that stick out on either side, and they kind of pop into the chassis, and you can just pull the chassis off to the side and that skid plate will come out. And to my surprise, the motor came out with it. I don't know, it shouldn't have been a surprise, but I was surprised in this moment. And what's great is that I already removed the 2 screws on the bottom of the skid plate. There's only 1 screw left to go, which I'm pointing to right here. And once we remove that, then the transmission and motor should just come off of that skid plate. And so once again, using that 1.3 millimeter hex driver, and now we're good to go. All right, so we've got these parts here. Let's do a quick weight test and compare what we're working with. So Old World was 2.9 grams versus 22 grams. So almost 20 more grams coming from the set. Maybe some better hardware too. Let's get it put together. I think the first step is just putting that motor and diff mount back on. Got this mounted back on. Now it's time to get it back onto the chassis at the same time, because I did not take, actually the linkages came off, so the diff should be fine. So what I'll do is just pop this back in there. There we go. That's it. Not a lot of room in there. I think next up is getting those 2 screws put in to fully seat the
center diff onto the cover. Keep saying center diff and motor and use them interchangeably. The motor's attached to the center diff when it comes out. So I'm just going to call them the same thing. But technically this is screwing into the diff. But it's an RC car, so it doesn't really matter, does it? Slotted that back in. Oh, that's annoying. So somehow I managed to get a wire pinned up here in the wrong spot. Actually, here we go. Wedge this out just a little bit. Can pull this over. Fairing on the side there. Wasn't terribly bad, something to watch out for, but otherwise fine. I thought I was gonna have to take the whole part off again. Okay, cool. Plate is on, but there we go. Looking good. So next up is the steering knuckles, and this car actually has four-wheel steering, so you could theoretically put it on the front or the back, but generally speaking, you want to have your weight on the front. So we are going to mount it to these front knuckles here. So to get started with that, what you do is just pull this hex back, and when you do, there's a tiny little pin right here that is going to pop out. We'll take the linkages, which is just that one screw in the front there. Yeah, that screw can stay in there. There's some sort of a bushing in there that's stuck in. So I'll leave the screws in the linkages as I'm doing the work. There you go, you can see that little bushing that's stuck in. So we're just gonna leave the screws in there, and now it's pretty much straightforward for pulling these things off. One screw on the top, one screw on the bottom. And now this should just pop off. Note the axle, when you pull off the steering knuckle, it's gonna wanna come out. So just pop that back in there, keep it in there for now. You've got this end of the axle, I guess. So we'll just set that to the side here because we're gonna need that. And then you've got the two bearings on either side of the steering knuckle that we're gonna have to pop out. You can use an Allen key, or I'm sure it's not the best, but I think that's the go-to way of doing these things. All right, so we've got the two steering knuckles plus the screws. We'll pop those back on here. And it looks like we're picking up, 2.1 grams from these things, so not a lot on the new set, but 16 from this versus 2 in totality for the plastic ones that they come with. We'll get the bearings put into the new brass ones. We'll pop an axle through, and we'll go ahead and get this mounted. All right, there's definitely a top and a bottom, and I've done this the wrong way. Let's back these off and I'll explain the difference. How many more times am I gonna drop these screws while I do this? That sucks. So each of these steering knuckles has like a slanted side. So there's one side that's a little bit wider on one side and then shorter on this side, or thinner, right? When you think about how this is mounted up, that means it's either gonna push it up or at the top of the tire up, right? Or it's gonna have it tilt in. The thing is though, these parts of the axle are already at a slant, right? So what we're gonna wanna do here is counter that slant so that we end up with a kind of an even plane. So you'll see here that the top side should be the wider of the two and the bottom side should be the thinner of the two. And then you can see that the edge of the steering knuckle is perpendicular with the direction of the axle. Fantastic to have found out now before getting the tires on. All right, there we go. We've got the two steering knuckles on. We'll need to get this thing mounted up. Actually, before we do that, we're going to take off this front diff cover and mount in these new ones here. 6 screws on this front diff cover. Should be pretty straightforward. Hopefully these come out nicely. All right, and there we go. Front diff cover is off. It comes with this one has a bearing in it, so I don't think the new set will have those. Let's do a quick check. Bags. Oh, it does, cool. So there's a new bearing in there. So we'll just load this all up with the screw. Looks like we're about 1 gram right there for that set. These appear to be the exact same, so we'll just assume 2 grams for the full complete set there. So we're looking at a whopping 7.8 grams is what we're gonna get from this new set here. All right, let's pop that new bearing into the new front diff cover. Put that on. That's relatively straightforward. It doesn't seat nicely though, which makes me think the bearings are on. The bearing looks happy. Just doesn't want to sit nicely. So the front and rear look identical, which makes sense because it's the same axle front and back. But the fact that it's not sitting on there nicely is throwing me for a bit of a loop. Everything looks like it's nicely seated in here. Drop some screws into it and call it a day, but it does feel like that might just solve the problem here. So let's give it a whirl. Managed to get it all the way clipped on there, but in doing so, well, it looks like it's coming apart again. The servo, where it mounts right here, came off. And the drivetrain has fallen out of place. So lots of moving pieces here. I don't know if I'm doing this the right way or if I should have taken pieces apart in order to achieve this. Kind of feels like the answer is yes there. But I think my first step here is try to get the drivetrain back together or reconnected. But this is what's so strange. Like, oh, there we go. I'm just trying to do too much at once, I think is my problem. All right, so let's take one of the long screws now, pop that in. This is not as simple as I was hoping it would be. So the top part of the diff cover actually goes and holds the servo mount in place. So that's just like a fun thing you have to manage as you're doing all of this. And then bottom ones are relatively straightforward, and that just seats it nicely. Cool, that's all good to go. Time to put steering linkages back together. All right, all back together. Got that new brass front diff cover. We've got the new brass steering knuckles on the right side. I mean, just feeling this thing now, like it feels a lot heavier in the front. Not like crazy or anything, but like noticeably different than the rear as I'm holding these two. It just feels a lot more solid, which I guess to be expected. The rear is going to be the exact same process, so I won't walk through that one step by step, but I'll do a final weigh-in and talk about performance next. All right, last step, the ever heavy body shell. We started this, or I guess the last time we made mods to this, it was 344.9 grams is what we ended up with, and so that was before everything we did today. We'll check again and see where we're at. So zeroed out, get that on there nicely. Looking like 390. So picked up an extra 45 grams and change. Now, obviously, the weight doesn't matter if it doesn't perform, so let's figure out based off that initial test with a rock to see if there's any difference. Maybe a little, I don't know. Yeah, I see nothing right there, right? Like there's no compression. And we wouldn't expect it, well, back doesn't matter as much, but there's definitely something going on there. And then from what I can tell right there, there's just not a whole lot. And then on that front tire, when it drops over, like the points where you'd expect it to have the most squish and the biggest contact patch, it just isn't really producing them, which makes me think it's a tire or foam issue rather than a weight issue at this point. But you know, not a huge amount that we added. It's like a seventh of overall weight, whatever that is in percentage. But we'll test it outside and see how it works.
So this is by no means a scientific approach to measuring how much better those 45 grams made this car perform, but it is something that it's a course that I've done a couple of times with this crawler, and I know that it doesn't perform well in certain parts and performs a little bit better in other areas. Not to say that I'm doing the same line perfectly the same every time, but roughly I have a good sense for how well it's performing and how it's performed versus past runs. So this course has a fair bit of vertical deltas and a good amount of undulation, and so you do get to see the articulation come into play a little bit, and just importantly, how well the axles are at staying on the ground, or basically somewhat grounded. And overall, the new brass weighted pieces, they improve the car a little bit. It's nothing crazy, but it's good enough that I think for $20 or $25, whatever the price of these new pieces are, it's worth it. Like it's incremental upgrade. It's 45 grams. It's not crazy. It's not, hey, I'm going from plastic wheels to brass wheels, but it's enough to make a slight improvement. So definitely worth giving it a shot. If you got an extra $25 hanging around that you want to throw on the car. But yeah, there's some more footage here of it performing. It's not great on things like the side hills still. Struggles a bit there, but generally speaking, the front end stays down a little bit more, which I think is mostly just due to the steering knuckles that we added in.